The valley had gone silent in the way that precedes violence. 6 Navy SEALs pressed their bodies against the crumbling mud wall of a compound that smelled of diesel and old blood, their radios crackling with static that meant nothing good. They were 12 miles inside hostile territory, pinned down by forces that had appeared from nowhere, and the extraction bird that was supposed to pull them out had taken an RPG through the tail rotor 40 minutes ago. Now it was just them, the mountains, and the certainty that someone knew exactly where they were. The team leader, a man named Harwick who had survived 3 tours without a scratch, keyed his radio one more time. His voice was steady, professional, empty of hope. Raptor 6, this is Kodiak Actual. We are combat ineffective and surrounded. Please advise. The response was the hiss of distance and encryption. Somewhere far above, in the operational command center, people were making calculations about acceptable losses. The sun was setting behind the peaks, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise, and the SEALs could hear engines, now heavy vehicles, moving through the village below. They had maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. Then something changed. A sound rolled across the valley, low and guttural, like a predator growling before it strikes. The SEALs looked up, scanning the ridgelines, trying to place it. It wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't a drone, it was something older, something meaner, and it was getting closer. One of the younger operators, a kid from Ohio who still had his college ring on a chain around his neck, whispered into the team channel. "Is that what I think it is?" Harwick didn't answer. He was too busy watching the sky. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now, the throaty roar of twin turbofan engines pushing an airframe that had been designed in the 1970s and had never once been retired because nothing else could do what it did. An A-10 Thunderbolt II, ugly as sin and twice as mean, appeared over the eastern ridge like a ghost made of titanium and depleted uranium. It was flying low, dangerously low, close enough that the SEALs could see the painted shark teeth on its nose and the weathered gray paint that had been scorched by muzzle flash 1,000 times. The aircraft didn't circle. It didn't request confirmation. It just rolled into a gun run without hesitation, without clearance, without orders. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon opened up with a sound that could crack the sky in half, a deep rolling BRRRRT that echoed off the mountains and made the ground shake. 730mm rounds chewed through the lead vehicle below like it was made of paper, and the valley erupted into chaos. The insurgents who had been moving to surround the compound scattered, their confidence evaporating under the weight of 30mm high-explosive incendiary rounds that could punch through tank armor. They pulled up hard, banking west with a grace that seemed impossible for something so brutish, and then it came around again. And again. Each pass was surgical, deliberate, the pilot threading the aircraft between mountains with a precision that bordered on reckless. SEALs watched in stunned silence, their situation transformed in the span of 60 seconds from hopeless to survivable. Harwick finally keyed his radio, his voice rough with something that might have been awe. "Unknown A-10, this is Kodiak Actual. You just saved our lives. Identify yourself." There was a pause, and then a voice came through, calm and steady with the faintest trace of a southern accent. "Kodiak Actual, Hog 2-3, stay low. I'm not done yet." The call sign meant nothing to Harwick. The aircraft was supposed to be 30 miles away, flying routine patrol over a safe corridor. There was no reason for it to be here, no authorization for weapons release in this grid square. But it was here, and it was buying them time they didn't have. They made another pass, this time releasing a pair of Mark 82 bombs that obliterated a machine gun nest that had been setting up on the northern ridge. The explosions lit up the valley, throwing shadows that danced across the compound walls, and the SEALs used the distraction to consolidate their position. The kid from Ohio was smiling now, the kind of manic grin that comes from realizing you're not going to die today. "Whoever that is, I'm buying them a drink. A whole goddamn case." But Harwick wasn't smiling. He was thinking about the voice on the radio, the way it had been too calm, too controlled. He'd heard a lot of pilots in his career, and this one sounded different, focused, driven, like they had something to prove. The A-10 came around again, slower this time, and Harwick could see it more clearly now. The aircraft was scarred, patched in places, the kind of warbird that had been through more missions than most pilots fly in a career. And painted just below the canopy, small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking, was a name. Not a call sign, a name. Viper. The SEALs didn't know it yet, but that name carried weight, history, a reputation that had been built over years in skis that didn't forgive mistakes. But they would learn. They would all learn. The A-10 continued its orbit, a guardian angel made of aluminum and ammunition, and the valley that had been their graveyard became something else entirely. A proving ground. A place where legends are born from the wreckage of impossible odds. And somewhere high above, behind the scratched canopy of an aging attack aircraft, the pilot known as Viper checked her fuel gauge, calculated how many more runs she could make, and decided it didn't matter. The SEALs below weren't dying on her watch. Not today, not ever. The second vehicle convoy arrived from the south just as the sun touched the horizon, and with it came the realization that this wasn't a random insurgent cell. This was coordinated. The enemy had been waiting, watching, feeding intelligence up the chain until they were certain the SEALs were isolated and vulnerable. They had expected an easy kill, a propaganda victory. They hadn't expected Viper. The A-10 rolled in again, and this time the pilot's voice came through the radio with new instructions. Kodiak Actual, mark your position with infrared strobe. I'm going to put ordnance danger close. Harwick didn't hesitate. He pulled the IR marker from his kit and activated it, trusting a pilot he'd never met with his life and the lives of his team. The A-10 descended through the gathering darkness, its silhouette stark against the deepening blue of the sky, and released a cluster of rockets that streaked downward like falling stars. The explosions walked a line 50 meters from the compound wall, close enough that the SEALs felt the concussion through their boots, close enough that shrapnel pinged off the stone around them. But the rockets hit exactly where they needed to, shredding the advancing convoy and sending the survivors running for cover that no longer existed. The kid from Ohio let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like an hour. That's the best flying I've ever seen. Harwick had to agree, though he didn't say it out loud. He'd worked with air support before, had seen Apache and Vipers and even a Spectre gunship tear through enemy positions with brutal efficiency. But this was different. This was personal. The A-10 wasn't just providing cover. It was hunting. And the prey knew it. The valley went quiet again, but this time the silence was theirs. The enemy had pulled back, melting into the mountains the way they always did, leaving behind burning vehicles and the kind of chaos that comes from underestimating your opponent. The SEALs began to regroup, checking ammunition and treating wounds, moving with the efficiency of men who had been given a second chance. Harwick keyed his radio one more time. Hog 2-3, Kodiak Actual. We are secure and preparing for EXFIL. Request you return to base and accept our gratitude. The response was immediate. Negative, Kodiak. I'm staying on station until your wheel's up. You don't walk out of here alone. There was something in the pilot's voice now, an edge that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not fear. Something harder to define. A promise, maybe, or a debt being paid. Harwick looked at his team, saw the relief on their faces, and made a decision. Copy that, Hog 2-3. We're moving to secondary EXFIL point. Coordinates to follow. The team moved out under the cover of darkness, the A-10 circling overhead like a guardian that refused to leave its post. They moved quickly but carefully, every sense tuned to the possibility of ambush, but the valley remained quiet. The enemy had learned their lesson. The extraction helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, a Chinook that came in fast and hard, its rotors beating the air into submission. The SEALs loaded up in seconds, their training taking over, and as the bird lifted off, Harwick caught one last glimpse of the A-10 through the open ramp. It waggled its wings once, a gesture as old as aviation itself, and then peeled away into the night. The SEALs cheered, a raw sound of survival and gratitude, but Harwick stayed quiet. He was thinking about the name painted on the fuselage. Viper. He would remember that. Back at the forward operating base, the debrief was supposed to be routine. The SEALs filed their reports, describing the ambush and the miraculous air support that had saved them. But when Harwick mentioned the A-10, the call sign Hog-23, the intelligence officer's expression changed. The officer pulled up a flight manifest on his tablet, scrolled through the entries, and then looked up with something like confusion. There's no record of an A-10 being authorized in that sector. Hog-23 was assigned to a patrol route 40 miles west. They weren't supposed to be anywhere near your position. Harwick leaned forward, his voice low. Well, they were there, and they saved our lives. The officer nodded slowly, making a note. I'll need to investigate this. An unauthorized deviation, weapons release without clearance in a restricted zone. That's serious. The SEALs exchanged glances. Serious. The word hung in the air like a threat. Someone had broken the rules to save them, and now there would be consequences. It was the kind of military logic that made sense on paper and nowhere else. The kid from Ohio spoke up, his voice harder than it had been in the valley. Whoever flew that bird deserves a medal, not an investigation. The intelligence officer didn't respond. He just closed his tablet and left the room, his face unreadable. The SEALs sat in silence, the weight of the day settling over them. They were alive. That should have been enough. But already they could feel the machinery of bureaucracy grinding into motion, turning a moment of heroism into a question of protocol. Harwick stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where a battered A-10 was being refueled under the floodlights. Even from this distance he could see the scorch marks on its wings, the patched bullet holes in the fuselage. It looked like it had been through a war, because it had. And so had the pilot. He made a decision then, one that would follow him for the rest of his career. He was going to find out who Viper was. And he was going to make sure the brass understood exactly what had happened in that valley, because some things matter more than regulations. The next morning, Harwick found himself standing outside a prefabricated building that served as the squadron commander's office. The A-10 unit was small, just 6 aircraft and a rotating crew of pilots who flew the kind of missions that didn't make the news. Close air support, ground interdiction, the unglamorous work of modern warfare. He knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel named Briggs who looked like he'd been carved from granite, glanced up from his paperwork. "You're the SEAL from yesterday." It wasn't a question. Harwick nodded. "I need to speak with the pilot, Hog-23." Briggs leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "That's not how this works. You file a commendation through channels and we handle it internally." Harwick didn't move. "With respect, sir, this isn't about a commendation. That pilot broke every rule in the book to save my team. The least I can do is say thank you in person." Something shifted in Briggs' face, a flicker of respect or maybe resignation. He stood and gestured toward the door. "Follow me." They walked across the flight line, past mechanics working on an aircraft that had taken small arms fire on a mission Harwick knew nothing about. The morning sun was harsh, turning the desert base into a furnace, but Harwick barely noticed. He was focused on the figure standing beside the A-10 at the far end of the line, running a pre-flight check with the kind of meticulous care that spoke of experience. The pilot was smaller than he'd expected, wearing a flight suit that had been patched more times than he could count, and when she turned to face them, Harwick understood immediately why the intelligence officer had been so careful with his words. Captain Myra, Viper. Kine was 34 years old and looked like she'd spent every one of those years proving something to someone. Her face was lean and weathered, her eyes the kind of pale gray that seemed to see straight through you, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stopped caring what other people thought a long time ago. She saluted Briggs, her movements precise, and then looked at Harwick with an expression that gave away nothing. "Your Kodiak Actual." Her voice was the same one he'd heard over the radio, calm and steady, with that trace of southern warmth that made you think of magnolias and bourbon. Harwick extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday. You saved my team." Viper shook his hand once, her grip firm, and then let go. "I was in the area." It was the most understated thing Harwick had ever heard, and he couldn't help but smile. "You were 40 miles out of position. You flew into a hot zone without orders. You put ordnance danger close to friendly forces. That's not being in the area. Viper's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. Acknowledgement maybe, or warning. I heard chatter on the emergency frequency. Sounded like you needed help. Briggs cleared his throat, a sound that suggested this conversation was about to become official. Captain Kine has already been briefed on the situation. There will be an inquiry. Viper nodded once, her face betraying nothing. Understood, sir. Harwick felt anger building in his chest, the kind that comes from watching someone get punished for doing the right thing. An inquiry? She's a hero. My team would be dead without her. Briggs' expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. That's not how the Air Force sees it. Unauthorized weapons release, deviation from assigned patrol, violation of engagement protocols. These are serious matters. Harwick wanted to argue, wanted to tear into the system that could turn salvation into a liability, but Viper spoke first. It's fine. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. I knew what I was doing. Harwick looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he recognized. The same thing he'd seen in the mirror after his first mission went sideways and he'd had to make a choice between the rules and what was right. She wasn't scared of the inquiry. She was resigned to it. Like she'd been here before. Briggs dismissed them both with a nod and walked back toward his office, leaving Harwick and Viper standing in the shadow of the A-10. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and strange all at once. Finally, Harwick spoke. Why Viper? She glanced at him, then back at her aircraft. You really want to know? He nodded. She reached up and touched the nose of the A-10, her fingers tracing the faded paint of the shark teeth. First combat mission, I was 26. We were supporting a Marine unit that got ambushed. They were taking fire from 3 sides, and I was the only air support available. My wingman had RTB'd with a hydraulic failure, and I was low on fuel and ammunition. The ground commander told me to hold off, wait for reinforcements. She paused, her eyes distant. I didn't wait. I went in alone, made 4 passes, burned through everything I had. When I landed, my squadron commander asked me why I disobeyed a direct order. I told him that Marines don't wait, and neither do I. He said I was like a viper, striking fast and without warning. She looked at Harwick, and for the first time he saw a hint of a smile. It stuck. Harwick felt something shift in his understanding of the woman standing before him. This wasn't just a pilot. This was someone who had built a career on the edge of a knife, who had saved lives by breaking rules and paid for it every single time. They gave you hell for it. It wasn't a question. They always do. Viper turned back to her aircraft, her hands moving over the control surfaces with practiced ease. But the Marines lived. That's what matters. Harwick wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that people like her were the reason people like him survived, but he knew she didn't need to hear it. She already knew. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his team patch, a simple design of a bare silhouette with the words KODIAK actual beneath it. He held it out to her. For your collection. Viper took the patch, studied it for a moment, and then tucked it into a pocket on her flight suit. Thanks. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. A bridge between 2 people who lived in different worlds but understood the same truth. That night the inquiry began. It was held in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and fluorescent lighting, and it was attended by officers who had never flown combat and never would. They reviewed the flight data, the radio transcripts, the weapons expenditure reports. They asked questions in the dry, clinical language of people who measured risk in spreadsheets instead of lives. And Viper answered every question with the same calm precision she'd used to put ordnance on target. Yes, she had deviated from her assigned patrol. Yes, she had engaged without explicit authorization. Yes, she understood that her actions violated standing engagement protocols. But when they asked her if she would do it again, she didn't hesitate. Yes, sir, without question. The lead officer, a colonel with a chest full of ribbons he'd earned in peacetime, frowned. You understand that your actions put both yourself and ground forces at significant risk. Viper met his gaze without blinking. With respect, sir, the ground forces were already at risk. I mitigated that risk. They're alive, that's the mission. The room went silent. The kind of silence that meant someone had just said something that couldn't be argued with but also couldn't be officially acknowledged. The colonel made a note, his pen scratching across paper with deliberate slowness, and then dismissed her. As Viper stood to leave, he spoke again. "Off the record, Captain. Good work." She nodded once and walked out, leaving the officers to their deliberations. Outside, the desert sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of home. She stood on the flight line and looked at her A-10, at the scars and patches that told the story of 100 missions, and she felt the weight of what was coming. They would probably ground her. Maybe permanently. That was how these things worked. You saved lives and they punished you for it because the system valued order over outcomes. But as she stood there watching the light fade, she realized she didn't regret it. Not for a second. The SEALs were alive. That was enough. The decision came down a week later. Viper was officially reprimanded, placed on administrative leave pending further review, and reassigned to non-combat duties. It was the kind of career death sentence that came wrapped in bureaucratic language, designed to push her out without the mess of a dishonorable discharge. She took the news with the same stoic calm she'd shown during the inquiry, packed her gear, and prepared to leave the squadron that had been her home for 6 years. But something unexpected happened. The SEALs, all 6 of them, filed formal commendations on her behalf. They wrote letters, gave interviews, made noise in channels that couldn't be easily ignored. Harwick went further. He contacted a reporter he knew, someone who had embedded with SEAL teams before and understood the value of a good story. Within 48 hours, the story of the A-10 pilot who had saved 6 Navy SEALs without orders was spreading through military networks and then into the civilian world. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. Suddenly, Viper wasn't just a pilot facing a reprimand. She was a symbol. The Air Force brass found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't quietly push out a pilot who had become a public hero without looking like they valued regulations over lives. But they also couldn't ignore the fact that she had violated multiple protocols. So they did what bureaucracies always do when faced with contradictory pressures. They compromised. Viper's reprimand was reduced to a written warning. She was allowed to return to flight status, but with restrictions. No solo missions. No deviations from assigned parameters. And most importantly, no more heroics. She accepted the terms without complaint, knowing that she had pushed the system as far as it would bend and survived. But the restrictions chafed. Every mission felt like flying with one hand tied behind her back. Every decision filtered through layers of authorization that slowed response times and put lives at risk. She watched from above as ground forces engaged enemy positions, waited for clearance that came too late, and felt the weight of what she couldn't do. 3 months after the Valley incident, Harwick rotated back to the States. Before he left, he made one final trip to the flight line. Viper was there, as he'd known she would be, running post-flight checks on an aircraft that had just returned from a milk-run escort mission. She looked tired, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Heading home?" she asked, not looking up from her checklist. "Yeah, thought I'd say goodbye." She nodded, her hand still moving over the aircraft with automatic precision. "Be safe out there." Harwick hesitated, searching for the right words. "They're making a mistake, keeping you on a leash like this." Viper finally looked at him, and her eyes were harder than he remembered. "It's their Air Force. I just fly in it." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she deserved better, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Instead, he saluted her, a gesture of respect between warriors, and she returned it with the same crisp precision she brought to everything. As Harwick walked away, he wondered if he would ever see her again. The military was like that, throwing people together in moments of crisis, and then scattering them across the world. But he carried the memory of that day in the valley with him, the sound of the A-10's cannon, and the calm voice on the radio that had promised they wouldn't die alone. It was the kind of memory that defined a career, that you measured everything else against. And he knew with absolute certainty that someday the world would need Viper again, because people like her didn't retire, they didn't fade away. They just waited for the next impossible situation, the next time someone needed saving. And when that moment came, regulations and restrictions wouldn't matter. She would do what she always did. She would fly into the chaos, alone if she had to, and make the difference between survival and another name on a memorial wall. That was who she was. That was Viper. 2 years passed. Viper flew routine missions, logged her hours, and watched younger pilots earn the glory she'd once chased. She trained them, passed on the lessons she'd learned in skis that tried to kill her, and tried to find purpose in the margins of a military that had decided she was too dangerous to trust. The restrictions never lifted. If anything, they tightened. Every flight plan scrutinized, every radio call monitored. She had become a liability in a system that valued predictability over excellence, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found a reason to ground her permanently. She considered leaving, taking an early retirement and finding work in the civilian sector. But every time she thought about walking away, she remembered the SEALs pressed against that compound wall, the sound of their voices on the radio, the way they cheered when the Chinook lifted them to safety. She remembered why she flew. And she stayed. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 hours before dawn. Viper was in her quarters, reading a book she'd already read twice, when her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. She grabbed her flight suit and was on the flight line in 4 minutes, adrenaline cutting through the fog of half-sleep. The briefing was short and brutal. A special operations team, designation classified, had been conducting a reconnaissance mission in a border region when they'd stumbled into something bigger. Now they were trapped, outnumbered, and facing an enemy force that included armor and coordinated air defense. Multiple extraction attempts had failed. 2 helicopters were already down. The team had maybe an hour before they were overrun. Command was throwing everything available at the problem, and that included every A-10 within range. Viper listened to the briefing with the cold focus that came from years of turning panic into action, and when the squadron commander asked for volunteers to fly into what was essentially a suicide mission, her hand was the first one up. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. He knew her history, knew about the valley, the inquiry, the restrictions that were supposed to keep her on a leash, but he also knew what was at stake. Hog 2-3, you're cleared for immediate launch. Call sign for this operation is Guardian Angel. Your mission is to provide close air support and buy time for extraction. Rules of engagement are weapons free. Repeat, weapons free. Viper felt something unlock in her chest, a door that had been sealed for 2 years suddenly thrown open. Weapons free. No restrictions. No waiting for authorization. Just her aircraft, and the mission. She ran to her A-10, completed the pre-flight in record time, and was wheels up before the sun touched the horizon. The flight to the target area took 20 minutes, and she spent every second of it reviewing the tactical situation, memorizing coordinates, planning attack runs. The terrain was worse than the valley had been. A nightmare of ridges and ravines that turned radar into guesswork and made visual targeting the only reliable option. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a team of operators was fighting for their lives. The radio crackled to life as she approached the operational area. Guardian Angel, this is Reaper 1-6. We are combat ineffective and taking heavy fire. Multiple casualties. Request immediate air support. The voice was strained, urgent, but still professional. The voice of someone who knew they were dying but refused to accept it. Viper keyed her mic. Reaper 1-6, Guardian Angel, I'm 2 minutes out. Mark your position with IR and stay low. This is about to get loud. She crested the final ridge and the battlefield opened up below her, a scene of chaos and violence that made the valley look like a training exercise. The Special Operations team was pinned in a dried riverbed, surrounded on 3 sides by enemy forces that were moving in for the kill. Armored vehicles were advancing from the north, technical trucks with mounted weapons from the east, and infantry closing from the south. It was a coordinated assault, well-planned and expertly executed. And it was about to meet an A-10 pilot with nothing left to lose. Viper rolled into her first gun run without hesitation. the GAU-8 coming alive with that beautiful, terrible sound that had been echoing in her dreams for 2 years. The lead armored vehicle disintegrated under the weight of 30mm rounds, its turret separating from the chassis in a spray of fire and shrapnel. She pulled up hard, banked east, and came around again, this time targeting the technical trucks that were pouring machine gun fire into the riverbed. The trucks exploded in sequence, her rounds walking through them like a giant's footsteps, and the infantry that had been advancing behind them scattered. But there were too many of them, too many targets, too much ground to cover. She was one aircraft against an army, and the math didn't favor her. The radio crackled again. Guardian Angel, Reaper 1-6, good hits. We've got multiple targets still advancing from the south. Can you engage? Viper checked her ammunition counter. She was already down to 60% and the mission had just started, but the answer was never in doubt. Copy, Reaper, rolling in now. She dove toward the southern approach, flying so low that she could see the faces of enemy fighters scrambling for cover. They fired back, small arms and machine guns, and she felt the impacts as rounds punched through the A-10's skin. The aircraft shuddered but kept flying because that's what A-10s did. They took damage and kept fighting, just like their pilots. She released her rockets in a single salvo, watching as they streaked downward and turned the southern approach into a killing field. The enemy advance stalled, then broke, fighters abandoning their positions and running for the hills. It was the kind of victory that bought time, not security. They would regroup, bring up reinforcements, try again. But for now, the Special Operations team had breathing room. Viper climbed back to altitude and circled the battlefield, her eyes scanning for new threats, her mind already calculating how long she could stay on station before fuel became a critical issue. The sun was rising now, painting the mountains in gold and red, and she could see smoke rising from a dozen burning vehicles. The radio came alive with a new voice, one that carried authority and exhaustion in equal measure. Guardian Angel, this is Reaper Actual. On behalf of my team, thank you. We thought we were done. Viper felt a familiar tightness in her throat, the emotion she always kept locked away threatening to surface. Reaper Actual, Guardian Angel, you're not done until you're home. I've got fuel for 90 more minutes. Nobody's touching you while I'm in the sky. It was a promise she might not be able to keep, but it was the truth. She would stay until her tanks ran dry, until her ammunition was exhausted, until the airframe fell apart around her. Because that's what you did. That's what the mission required. And Viper had never walked away from a mission in her life. The next hour was a blur of gun runs and rocket attacks, of dodging ground fire and coordinating with the ground team as they consolidated their position. She destroyed 6 more vehicles, suppressed 3 machine gun nests, and turned the battlefield into such a nightmare that enemy reinforcements stopped advancing and started digging in. But the fuel gauge was dropping faster than she'd hoped, and ammunition was becoming critical. She keyed her radio, her voice still calm despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. Reaper Actual, Guardian Angel, I'm Winchester on rockets and down to 20% gun. EXFIL Bird Ada. There was a pause, too long, and when the response came it carried the weight of bad news. Guardian Angel, EXFIL is delayed. Enemy air defense assets are active in the corridor. They're working the problem, but no ETA yet. Viper felt her jaw tighten. Delayed. That was military speak for, we don't know if we can get them out. She looked at her fuel gauge again, did the math. She had maybe 45 minutes before she had to turn for base or risk running dry in hostile territory. 45 minutes to hold off an enemy force that was regrouping and would come back stronger. She thought about the restrictions, the rules that said she should wait for authorization, coordinate with command, follow proper protocol. And then she thought about the voices on the radio, the team in the riverbed who had done everything right and still ended up trapped. Copy, Reaper Actual. I'll stay on station as long as possible. If EXFIL doesn't arrive in time, I'll make another run to buy you more hours. There was silence on the other end, and then Reaper Actual came back, his voice rough. Guardian Angel, that would put you below safe fuel margins. You'd never make it back. Viper looked out at the battlefield, at the mountains beyond, at the endless sky that had been her home for more than a decade. She thought about the valley, about Harwick and his team, about the inquiry and the restrictions and the career that had been slowly strangled by a system that didn't understand what she understood. That some things matter more than fuel margins, more than regulations, more than your own life. Reaper actual, I know. The words hung in the air, simple and final. And somewhere below, in a dried riverbed surrounded by enemies, a team of special operators understood exactly what she meant. That they weren't alone, that someone was watching over them, willing to burn their own future to keep them alive. The enemy came again 30 minutes later, a final desperate push to overrun the position before more air support arrived. They came from all sides simultaneously, a coordinated assault that showed they'd learned from their earlier failures. They brought up mortars, heavy machine guns, even an anti-aircraft battery that they set up on the eastern ridge. Viper saw it all from above, saw the trap closing, and knew this was the moment that would define everything. She could pull back, conserve her ammunition and fuel, wait for the cavalry to arrive. It was the smart play, the safe play. Or she could go all in, burn everything she had, and trust that it would be enough. There was no decision to make. There had never been a decision. She keyed her radio one last time. Reaper actual, guardian angel, going weapons free on all remaining ordnance. Danger close, keep your heads down. And then she dove. The A-10 screamed down through the morning air, the GAU-8 roaring as she poured her remaining ammunition into the advancing enemy. The anti-aircraft battery opened up, tracers reaching toward her like fingers trying to pull her from the sky. She felt the impacts, heard the warning alarms screaming in her headset, and ignored them all. The aircraft shook, hydraulics bleeding, but she held the dive, kept the trigger down, watched as her rounds tore through the enemy position. She pulled up at the last possible second, the ground rushing past close enough to touch, and the A-10 clawed its way back into the sky on wounded wings. The anti-aircraft battery was silent now, destroyed by her final pass, and the enemy assault had broken. The battlefield was littered with burning vehicles and fleeing fighters, and in the riverbed below, the Special Operations Team was still alive, still fighting, still defiant. Viper climbed to altitude, her aircraft groaning with every meter gained, and assessed the damage. Multiple hits to the fuselage. One engine running rough. Hydraulics at